I've been asked to talk about education, and that's a topic all of us are interested in. We have to be, because it's our own lives, and it's also the way we deal with other people, which is all education. So let me just begin by making a very simple distinction. There are education and schooling are not the same thing. I think you all know that, but it gets, sometimes the language, you talk about educational institutions and they immediately think of schools. A couple of generations ago, there was a radical thinker, and I hope you understand radical just means going to the roots of matters. So asking questions about why things are as they are. His name was Ivan Illich, and he wrote a book called De-Schooling Society. So, have any of you heard of that book? Okay. Well, the title is enough for our purposes. The idea of having a society without schools is almost unthinkable, isn't it? Because we're so accustomed to schools. But although I'm really not trying to say that he wanted to get rid of all schools, but the way in which the role that schools played in society at that time, he thought was not the best way to deal with education. Now, education can already be found in some animal species. Not nearly as much, because most of them, if the newborn cannot very quickly, I mean, if you think of a deer, the newborn has to be able to run from the wolf. From the time it's born, it's amazing. You just see it get up and run to escape. And humans are unusual in the length of time it takes us to become adults. Very unusual. And the reason for that is being an adult human is a much more complicated matter than being an adult lion or an adult alligator or any of those other things. And education, therefore, has been part of human species in ancient tribal cultures. How were children educated? Partly by explicit instruction, partly by copying what parents were doing, and of course, insofar as there was any specialization, there was usually gender specialization. The women would learn to gather the vegetables and fruits, and the boys would be taught how to hunt. So there was teaching and education, and the stories told around the campfire took the place of what later became schools. That was where one learned what it meant to be a member of that tribe and to take some pride in it and develop loyalty to it. Okay, well, that's just sweepingly saying when we think of schools, we need to think of a very particular kind of education. And when we take the whole sweep of human existence on the planet, it's only in recent times. I don't think there were really any institutions that we could call schools until there were written languages. They tended to emerge together. And the Hebrews developed schools where one studied the scriptures. The most influential schools, so far as the West is concerned, and since education now, schooling now, even in the East, is copied from the West. Sadly, I'm not going to get into that at the moment, but I'm not saying we should be proud and say that shows how good we are. It shows how powerful the West has been over the last few hundred years. But since I really want to do the history of Western education, I'll talk about the Greeks, because our educational institutions, our schooling, is in fairly direct continuity with what happened in Greece 2,500 years, or maybe a little longer than that ago. One way we know about the schools in Athens is from Socrates. And Socrates was critical of the schools, which had been developed to teach people how to get what they wanted voted on by, and accepted by the rest of the citizens. We call Greece a democracy, but we need to remember that the people who acted democratically were maybe 10% of the population. Obviously, women and children were not included, but most of the real work of Athens was being done by slaves or people who were hardly non-citizens in any case. And therefore, the people who had the time to gather for debate about what policies to adopt were people who didn't have to worry about working for a living. And the ability to influence other people was the gentleman's life work. And so the sophists were people who taught these citizens of Athens how to win arguments, or how to make speeches that would persuade people. Rhetoric was the chief art. And Socrates was very critical, because that meant that in these schools, no attention was given to whether something was good or bad, or whether it was true or false. It was simply to learn how to accomplish your purposes. Okay. Now, out of this general climate where when people went to somebody else and took them as their teacher and studied something, learning how to speak effectively was primary. They developed the liberal arts. The term liberal here means the arts of the free man, and teaching you how to use your freedom in an effective way. So there were the practical arts. People had to learn how to make shoes, and how to plow fields, and on and on and on. But those are not liberal arts, those are the practical arts. Okay. So the liberal arts are the arts of the cultured person, teaching them how to do well the things that cultured people could do. And so the liberal arts had two layers as it developed. I don't know whether this distinction was made in Greece or only later. But there was the trivium, which was entirely focused on speaking, on language, that had grammar and logic and rhetoric. And I really think rhetoric was what the grammar and the logic were used for. And then there was a quadrivium, and that included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Good, I got through them. I don't have any notes, so it all depends on whether I can come up with it at the moment. Okay. Well, the reason this is important is we still talk about liberal arts. Obviously, those 7 topics are not the basic content of liberal arts in our time. But the liberal arts, I'm sure you all know that with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the level of culture in the West was greatly diminished. Also, slavery was greatly diminished. And when you look at the wonderful achievements of ancient cultures, it's important to remember this is wonderful, all right, but of course they could have never been accomplished without slaves. And in the Middle Ages, slavery was not, I'm not saying the peasants had a great deal of freedom and power. Nevertheless, they were not slaves anymore for the most part. So it'd be more difficult for the boss to make people do such elaborate things. So it took several hundred years before the West recovered culturally from the collapse of Rome. But by the 11th, no, I'll say, to be sure, I'll say by the 12th century, Europe was ready to not only build great cathedrals and castles and so forth, but also, for the first time in human history, to create universities. So universities are a medieval creation. And they were based on liberal arts plus professional schools. Now, the liberal arts were not necessarily the 7 things I've just said, because the liberal arts in any epoch, even just by their definition, are thought of as what people who can give leadership in culture and society, who understand the tradition and can transmit it well and develop it, should know. And the idea of those universities was all professional people should be, in this sense, able to participate in the leadership of society. Other people could too, but the professionals first developed this kind of education, and then they studied there. There were just 3 professions. The most prestigious at that time was the ministry, but medicine was, of course, also extremely important, and then teaching. And they have remained. Well, no, I left out law, didn't I? That would make 4. I'm not sure teaching may not even have been developed sufficiently to be a profession. I think that may be what I was confused about. But, okay. Well, these universities that were established in the 12th century still exist and are still among the great universities of the world. I mean, this is not a minor. You've heard of Oxford University in England and Cambridge University. They were created in the Middle Ages, and until about maybe 200 years ago, what you studied there was not too different from what people had studied there before. The natural sciences were becoming very important in the English culture, but they didn't make their way into universities really until the 19th century. It's quite surprising because that is, of course, the heart of modern universities. Yeah. So the changes in the last couple of hundred years are what I really wanted to focus on, but you can see schooling, that could be other schooling for very specific purposes, but it really didn't take the form of fully developed institutions. I mean, if you wanted to be a cobbler, you became the apprentice of a cobbler. And of course you got educated, but that was something different. So learning to perform many of the tasks of society did not require that you go to school, go to these institutions. Okay, once, I think maybe the next major change took place when printing was developed and Protestantism came into being. These were somewhat related phenomena. During the early medieval period, the priests knew how to read. They had some education and could have very advanced education. But the rest of the people were just expected to accept the authority of the priest. So the Bible was not a widely read book. And some of the priests felt that was a mistake, and that the Christian faith is really the biblical faith. And Luther and Calvin are the two most important figures here. But it was their interest that all believers should be able to read the Bible for themselves. And much of the development of what we would call today public education, that is something that everybody needs to have. And of course, this everybody means, again, adult males of the, this was not nearly as extreme as it was in Athens. The cobblers and the, and the farmers were included in everybody in this case. So when we ask about the origins of our public schools in distinction from the origins of our universities, it really came about chiefly out of the desire that people be able to read the Bible for themselves. Well, I want to just say, of course, the question of what else schools are for, and for many people that the Bible business was not that important, but originally it was. Okay. So then what else is it for? It has had, public schools have had different functions. In the United States, in the 19th century, the main function of the public school was to Americanize immigrants. And they were really quite successful. And we have to be clear about when we say immigrants, we don't mean everybody who came into the country. We mean people who came from Western European-like countries. They needed to learn English, and they needed to learn American history, and they needed to learn American government, and they needed to be socialized, to be proud of being citizens of the United States, etc. Civics is sort of the central thing. So, of course, many of the schools were still very church-related, and Bible would be an important part of it. But when they did public schools, it was not so much that way. Then in the 20th century, our culture has shifted, and now being prepared to be able to work in business is the most important function of education. So American history, of course, is still taught. I'm not sure whether children always have a course in civics. At least it doesn't play the role. It used to play. But whatever the business world thinks everybody should be able to do. So reading, writing, and arithmetic are the heart of matters. There was also, in the 19th century, a lot of interest in elocution. And I think that was connected with citizenship. It's more continuous, as you can see, with the interests of the Greeks. Now, from the point of view of us old people, school children don't talk in a way that I can understand them. There's very little effort to teach speech, really, in schools, because that's not too important for the business world. So, whereas politics was primary in the 19th century, in the 20th century, business is the primary purpose of education, of schooling. I think education still has other roles, and that's partly my critique of the present situation of schools, including universities, is what this is building up to. Okay, well, when I was graduating from high school just before World War II, I was middle class, so it was sort of taken for granted that I would go to college. It was a class thing, and the college meant a liberal arts college. And even though the subject matter was very different from the Greeks, it still was the same kind of thing. The middle class is now the professional class, the kind of general cultural leadership class. And so we ought to know our history, our culture, well enough to be able to participate in it. And this is partly to enjoy it and be full persons ourselves, but it's also to go on. If you just go by the Pomona College and look and see what it says on the gates, Pomona College is a liberal arts college, of course. Now what it says on the gates and what actually happens is different, because that was 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, those were really the things people thought a college was about. And now, even what I call liberal arts colleges don't try to do what that's it. Now, I will focus, this is kind of jumping around, but I hope you're getting some sense of the diversity of roles that schooling can play and their relation to education. That's the main kind of sensibility I want you to develop. I went to a liberal arts college, and after the war, liberal arts colleges were still the main form of higher education, but very quickly that ceased to be the case. And it ceased to be the case for a very positive reason. And that is, it was felt that everybody should have a chance to go to college. But everybody, if you are educating everybody, that's a little different from you are educating an elite. And in a certain sense, you could say colleges, like the Claremont colleges, are still educating an elite. But the lines are not nearly as sharp, and we developed these community colleges and state colleges, state universities. The percentage of the population that goes on for further education after high school is vastly greater. And colleges have taken on the role of certifying people as being ready to perform all kinds of different roles in society. So, whereas if you say, for what job does a liberal arts education prepare you? The answer is, it's not designed to prepare you for a job. It's designed to prepare you for cultural leadership and good citizenship, and to be able to enjoy the riches of culture in your own personal life. It's for people who have a chance to participate in the world of music and art and so forth and so on. So they need to develop some ability to appreciate that. Okay. Now, in the early part of the 19th century, a different kind of university was created in Germany. And it is called, and we call it to this day, the modern university. It was the University of Berlin. And the University of Berlin focused on research. See, None of this business about pampering these individuals just so they could enjoy life more or could carry on, you know, that's a little fluffy. Research is the thing. We need to learn more, and we need to have places where people will study in order to advance knowledge in a particular field. Now, the Germans call these fields the Wissenschaften, the bodies of knowledge. I think the equivalent in our language is academic disciplines. See, liberal arts are not academic disciplines. This is a different conception of what makes up the schooling part of our education. And the idea of the academic discipline is that you identify some objective segment of the totality of reality, okay? It could be some, well, I mean, obviously biology. We're discussing life forms being the discipline. And, but that originally biology would have been a discipline, physics would have been a discipline, chemistry would have been a discipline, and sociology would have been a discipline, and economics, you understand. This is a new way of organizing a university. So it is not intended to be, what should I say, to make students better people or more effective people, except in the one area of doing research. In the liberal arts college, the liberal arts was supposed to be, the teachers and administrators were in locus parenti. I don't know whether you've heard that phrase. It used to be used a lot. When you sent your child off to college, the college took over the role of providing parental guidance and so forth. That, of course, very few colleges would claim to be doing anything of that sort. So it's not a student-centered. The study of the academic disciplines is not centered on the students, on their personal well-being, but it is centered on the discipline. And the disciplines have become the religions of most people in academia now. I was interested in hearing, you don't know him, I'm sure, but James Robinson was a leader in finding and acquiring documents from Nag Hammadi and in other parts of that part of the world. And some of this could be kind of cloak and dagger stuff, you know. I mean, it was, you can be pursuing the discipline and still get your hands dirty in particular ways. And he was saying that he and his colleagues would say, für die Wissenschaft. Okay, that's what I mean by it. It was the religion of that. If we can do anything to advance the discipline, that makes life worthwhile. But I hope you see the contrast between organizing higher education around disciplines and for the purpose of research. In case you have missed the point, the leading universities today would call themselves research, no, I'm not getting the crucial term, value-free research institutions. Value, you'll find that's in Harvard's description of itself, Yale's description of itself, and most state universities. Now, from my point of view, being value-free is almost the opposite of what education had been most of the time up until then. And you really need to think about what it means that we idealize. Of course, there is no value-free education. We all have values, and we all communicate the values intentionally or non-intentionally, but it means there is no reflection about values. There is no place in the university where you discuss whether this is the right way to organize a university. There's no place where you discuss what is the kind of society that we should be working for. It's not, well, I could go down the list, but those are value questions. And the university teaches us that value issues are unimportant. That's what I am most disturbed by. And since high school is organized to prepare people for going to the university, and grade school is organized to getting people into high school, when universities are value-free, you can be pretty sure you're not going to give a lot of attention to values at other segments of school. I will just make my charge as very explicit. I believe our educational system today teaches nihilism. And I think a great many people who have spent many years in school have not received any help in thinking about the meaning of their lives. Some of them don't even know there is such a question because it's never been mentioned. And if we had some other institutions that were able to reach most people and seriously help them, I wouldn't complain as much as I do about this. But there isn't any other institution in Western society that performs that role. The university teaches a rather, at least a condescending attitude toward being religious. If being religious means going to church and learning something in church school or something. So, I mean, some people say, oh, well, that's the job of the churches. I'm just saying the majority of American youth are not being encouraged to expose themselves to any institution in which values are the main topic. Well, what good does it do for you to understand that? We can't do much about it. But in an institution like this, you don't have to. You don't have to be careful to avoid expressing your personal views, which you do in the general educational system. And I think just the fact that most of you are people with real concern for those you are tutoring, that something will come through. I'm just saying, be proud of that. Don't be embarrassed. That the value of getting along well with other people, the value of working cooperatively instead of competitively, the value of moving the world in however limited a way in a direction where human beings can have a good planet to live on in the future. I don't think those are values anybody should be apologizing for trying to teach. So I'm hoping that, well, I will express one other reason for my believing the present university system. And I hope I don't have to say, of course there are lots of exceptions. Catholic universities obviously do not announce that they are value-free, and that they are significant. They play a significant role in our society. But still, the problem is that they have to, they or not have to, but they want to be excellent in academic ways, and so they hire their professors from institutions which have taught them that they must be value-free. It's, well, I will close this, I'll stop talking and let you ask any questions or just make any comments that you want to make. I have personally, my career has been affected by this shift from liberal arts, which are, of course, value-oriented ways of organizing education, to academic disciplines, which are value-free ways of organizing the material. From my point of view, I had the great good fortune of going to the University of Chicago when the chancellor of the university was the most visible and probably capable opponent of the academic disciplines, takeover of higher education. Now, he was not, he wasn't trying to defend the kind of standard brand liberal arts college of the time. The college that still survives at Chicago as a remnant of the kind of work he wanted to see done has a great books focus. You've heard of great books. None of the great books fit into any one academic discipline. They wouldn't be great books if they did. But if you are exposed to the greatest literature of the West, it's trying to open up a little bit to outside the West. It hadn't gotten very far in that respect. You are stimulated to think. And from his point of view, the most important function of the university is to help people to think for themselves. And of course, in order to think well, you have to have a fair amount of information. I mean, this is not saying you don't have to learn. But the best encouragement is to read books that are themselves very well informed, but also have very strong value orientations. And he was at one point given the title of chancellor, and he was free to select someone else to be president. And although he had no theological or churchy orientation, the school within the Divinity School that most strongly supported his focus on encouraging people to think for themselves, other than the college, was the Divinity School. And so he chose the dean of the Divinity School to be the president. Well, when he lost his struggle and Chicago joined the East Coast universities in focusing on research and value-free research, he left, came to Santa Barbara and created an institution out here. And Caldwell, who was the president under Hutchins, went to Emory, where he had gotten his own PhD in New Testament some years earlier. And he was troubled that most of the graduates of most of the jobs in teaching were in liberal arts colleges, but there would be no way you could get a PhD in teaching that would prepare you to teach liberal arts. So he created at Emory a Graduate Institute for Liberal Arts. And he brought me to Emory to work in that institute. So I'm talking about things that are very much central to my own experience in higher education. And then he came out here and became the founding president of the Claremont School of Theology. So I was myself very fortunate throughout my career to be able to focus on getting people to think for themselves rather than preparing them for academic research. You may be surprised at the extent to which, I mean, you would think in a school of theology, or if you wanted to teach in a school of theology, you would want to help your students understand how they should make use of the Bible in their preaching. But that kind of practical focus is disappearing from the teaching, from the graduate teaching of the Bible. It's now done in a purely academic way. I mean in the what I call the best programs, in the top universities. And schools of theology hire their professors of New Testament from, you're proud to have somebody from Harvard. But that actually damaged the schools of theology. We hired one New Testament scholar from Harvard who he was black and really cared personally a lot about the black cause, and that was for us a very important part of selecting him to come, because of course we were not a value-free school and we were not well positioned to be as much involved in that struggle as we wanted to be. But he had been so socialized that he could not allow his values to play any role in the way in which he taught the New Testament. And so the students could learn and get information, but black preachers do a much better job than he did. If your job is to learn how to use the Bible relevantly to the present situation in a positive way. That sometimes means preaching against the text. But so I'm not, this is not a sentimental stuff that I'm talking about. You see, the Bible is the main source of resistance to governments in the world. I don't really think there's anything comparable in any other tradition. And when you teach the Bible in seminary, you ought to lift up this powerful message that says that there's a higher loyalty than to whoever happens to be your president or king. I'm just giving you an illustration to indicate the kind of thing I mean. The Bible can make a contribution to the criticism of existing power structures. The maldistribution of wealth is protested against repeatedly in the Bible. And that's a highly relevant message for our time. That you cannot serve both God and money. Central biblical teaching, utterly radical in our world today. So I mean, that's what we wanted, but that's not. If you get a PhD from one of the best schools, you can't get that. Okay, you will understand. I think that this business of value-free education is a snare that has become, and people talk that way but continue to communicate values for a while. But now they really almost succeeded. And so my critique is, number one, the vast majority of people who get PhDs don't need to, they will spend their lives in other ways than doing research. We don't need all of our higher education to be focused on preparing people to do research. Number two, there ought to be some real reflection about what it is most important to do research on, and not allow that to be simply a matter of who pays for it. But if you're value free, then of course you'll accept you can get money to learn how to kill people in larger numbers faster, just as readily as you can get more money for that than you can for finding out how to create healthier societies or cultures. So, in my view, at the present time, the university does more harm than good. So that's not quite deschooling society, but I think you can see that. And I think that there are more people recognizing that we've made some mistakes along the way. So I don't feel totally lonely. But it's, speaking of China, they copied our universities without ever having gone through the liberal arts style. And so you see more purely and blatantly what value-free education is. And then you make the passing of an exam at the age of 12 the determinant of the whole rest of your life. And as a result, children from the age of 5 are studying for the exams, and they don't get to play. And I think that stealing childhood from children in order to get them into schools that teach them no values, but do help them get middle-class jobs instead of poor jobs. I think they have to say that it does help to do that. But my values say this is not the way to organize society and schooling. I don't think it really educates in a healthy way.